Good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be. I'm Dan Miller. I'm the coordinator of the FLAIR network, and I'm associate professor at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana in the United States. It's really great to see so many of you here for this second of the 5 events that we have at the 2021 FLAIR annual meeting. We had a great session to kick us off this morning, and we're really excited for this keynote presentation by Professor Arun Agrawal with commentary and discussion by Professor Jesse Ribot. So later today is now. Dr. Agrawal and Dr. Ribot will talk without slides. This will be a conversation. It's meant to be interactive. There'll be plenty of time for discussion at the end. And it's really a great opportunity for us in the FLAIR community to interact directly with 2 of the leading lights in our field. And I would say, for me, on a personal note, 2 of my intellectual heroes and dear friends and mentors. I won't say too much to introduce them. So Dr. Agrawal will speak first, and the title of his talk is on the Commons, a look ahead. I would say this is a webinar, just some housekeeping. It's a webinar, and so you can enter your questions as they arise in the Q&A. And then once the presentations are complete, you can also raise your hand, and we'll should be able to unmute you to allow you to ask your questions using your voice. I believe that's possible. So that's just some of the logistics. So Arun will speak first on the Commons, a look ahead, and then we'll hear from Dr. Jesse Ribot. Just a couple of words. So Arun Agrawal is a professor at the University of Michigan in their School for Environment and Sustainability, and he earned his PhD at Duke University after doing master's and undergraduate studies in India. His work, I believe, is known to many and perhaps all of you. And Dr. Jesse Ribot is now a professor at American University. We had the good fortune of being colleagues at the University of Illinois before that, and Jesse earned his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. It's really just an honor and a pleasure to introduce them. And I think without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Arun Agrawal. Arun, please take it away.
Thank you, Dan. I am very happy to have been invited. Thank you for inviting me to do this, well, not a keynote presentation, but perhaps a keynote discussion. I see my role as speaking for a few minutes and then really having a conversation with those of you who are also here. And I should say that I look at the title again, and I feel quite uncomfortable. And I feel uncomfortable because in retrospect, it looks both pompous and promising. And who wants to be pompous, and who has the capacity really to be promising? Who can see the future? But having said it, having used that title, I'll say a few things, and hopefully we can at least have a good discussion, even if we don't meet the promise of the title. And I am not going to use a PowerPoint. I'm going to speak from some written comments I put together. So my apologies for that. I think PowerPoints have become almost de rigueur in the world of presentations today, and I'm sorry not to meet that expectation. So I would say that scholarship in action on the Commons have many achievements to their name, with tens of thousands of research papers and position documents and analyses and policy statements from the Commons on common property, on common pool resources, on social ecological systems, on resource management, on local governance, and a whole range of other themes besides. How could How could that not be the case? As many would argue, knowledge-based change, it comes from, if it ever comes, from the collective accomplishments and findings in a body of work, not from individual studies. And certainly that is true of research on the commons. And why not? Research on the commons builds on and illustrates the possibilities of what I think of as a promise that is encoded in the very DNA of the idea of the commons. And at its most optimistic, the commons embody a hope, a promise, the promise of an alternative that lies beyond the familiar, the boring tropes of the market versus the state, exchange versus regulation, a false freedom, and the very real coercion. So yeah, we need to be clear that these gross concepts of market and state and freedom and coercion are irreal with regards to all of the claims that their boosters cheer. Work on the commons has strengthened, and these are, as said, looking ahead, but this is a look back. Work on the commons has strengthened theories of human choices and collective action. Does communication matter? Do structures of interactions affect outcomes? Does human nature conform to elegant theories of rational choice? Do game theoretic predictions match observed empirical patterns of behavior? Can self-interested agents work to advance collective goals? How do institutions aggregate individual actions into collective outcomes? For all of these questions and many more, scholars of commons pose compelling multiple lines of evidence-backed answers. Work on commons has deepened and broadened knowledge of diverse social ecological systems, and indeed, it is perhaps the most successful research program under the broad umbrella of social ecological systems research. It started with empirical work on historical commons and out-of-the-way places on systems widely believed to be fated for the dust heap of history. But it built on insights from such seemingly barren grounds to demonstrate that commons are as much a part of contemporary life as they were of past societies, of modern aspirations, as of historical experience, so much so that vast new areas of marine and terrestrial systems have transitioned to collective tenure, ownership, management, and access over the last 3 decades. Work on commons has advanced, elaborated, and developed novel methods to connect theoretical and empirical research. From a general reliance on case analyses and comparative studies in the past, it has moved to using sophisticated game theoretic, agent-based mathematical and econometric modeling, quantitative analyses, machine learning methods, causal inference models, experiments, remote sensing data and spatial models, network analyses, randomized trials, the list goes on. In the process, it has further enhanced these techniques and shed light on how to adapt them to users beyond the ones for which they were initially developed. Current research on the commons continues to build on these past achievements, attracting new participants into the loose network of researchers that see themselves as contributing to research on common property. These new contributions include identification of new factors and contextual characteristics that affect outcomes in resource commons. Indeed, ever since Ostrom provided a shot in the arm of commons research by identifying a concise set of factors that affect institutional persistence, researchers on the commons have ceaselessly investigated new factors that should be considered to really understand commons outcomes better. Current work has also begun to undertake joint assessment of commons outcomes with a particular focus on trade-offs and synergies in resource use outcomes. They are thus advancing how and to what extent things such as forest cover and livelihoods, biodiversity and carbon, livelihoods and equity are related in the workings of commons. This approach to considering multiple outcomes simultaneously brings research on commons closer to an understanding of what sustainability is, since by definition, sustainability concerns not just growth, not just the environment, not just the equity, but all of them together. Frameworks developed to understand resource commons and governance, the staple of scholarship on the commons in the past, are now also in evidence in research in many other areas characterized by social dilemmas. The analysis of space as commons, of healthcare, global governance, education, housing, cooperatives, sports, digital worlds, knowledge, again, the list goes on. And these extensions of work on commons go a long way towards showing that the idea of the commons is relevant far beyond water and trees, land and grass, fish and sheep, food and fiber. And at the same time, these shifts and evolutions in commons research can be seen as the expected change in a field of research as it grows older. It's evolution towards a normal science. Indeed, one measure of accomplishments of commons research is that it is no longer revolutionary to expect small, dispersed communities to manage their resources sustainably. The target, to demonstrate that commons work for dispersed resource arrangements, is no longer meaningful because it has been reached. But we, scholars of commons, continue to labor towards that same target, seemingly without realizing where we are. So I suggest that research on commons needs to accept its success if it is to move beyond it. The world we inhabit confronts a series of cascading disasters that cannot realistically be confronted or addressed without reinvigorating the hope that has been at the heart of research on the commons from the very beginnings of this field of research. The hope that the commons are an alternative. They are an alternative to the false promises of markets and state, of freedom that is no more than anomie, and of structured belonging that is no more than the imprint of the foot of the police on the face of one's neighbor. The future we confront is replete with the promise of deeper knowledge of where, who, why, and what we are, and our connections to the world. But it does so only because we encounter every day that extraordinary flood of data and mistake it for knowledge. Our future promises to be all about closer connections between places, peoples, and things because of the mobility that is the hallmark of modernity. But the intimacy we expect is still born without the community that the commons embody. The future promises prosperity and plenty only to dash that promise against the rocks of inequality and injustice. In the face of such pessimism, what hope for the commons? What hope for research on the commons? Is not the work on commons so small scale, so incremental, so minuscule as to be unequal to the task of reimagining what can be, rather than where we are going? I believe we reach that conclusion, and we say that only because we ignore what the commons stand for, an alternative, perhaps the only possible alternative, and instead focus on what we do in our research. In a very real sense, transformation only happens through its incorporation into the everyday worlds of being and practice. The commons are not just about rules and institutions, structured behaviors, and predictable outcomes. They're also about being able to imagine different worlds founded on visions that go beyond coercion and fear, incentives and temptation. Without such imagination and its incorporation into our everyday lives, a different world cannot come to pass. For me, the contrast Gramsci drew between the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will is thus the only possible foundation for an answer to our fears for the future. The commons promise connections and community. They embody worlds of solidarity. But pursuing them requires courage to move beyond what we do. We must imagine the worst that could reasonably be expected to happen, not to despair, but to summon the reserves of will and resources necessary to overcome the worst. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arun, for those really, there's lots to chew on in your remarks. And it's great that we have Jesse Ribot to offer some comments. Jesse.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And thanks, Arun. This material of Arun's is new to me. And I was asked to comment. I'm doing this spontaneously But I think there's a lot of really deep material that Arun is beginning to help us excavate. And that is, how do we take what we've learned from our study of the commons and apply it way beyond, as he said, water and trees, electronic spaces, the material world. And I think one of the things that is clear from this is that almost all collective action represents a commons. From Greta Thunberg's 25,000 person march, where she said enough times, no more blah, blah, blah about the UN meeting today, to unions and other groups acting on behalf of some imagined or actual public or a subgroup. So Arun was talking a little bit about science and normal science. We spoke just before about this, and he talked about common property work as normal science. And it is. We do research in fairly common, fairly normal ways of the natural sciences and social sciences. But I think where this has to go is, instead of normal science, science of and with norms. Norms of social action, and norms because what we envision as the future is a norm. And so how do we apply commons learning to new areas, to new challenges, and new forms of collective action? There are big future challenges, right? We're in the moment of the Conference of the Parties, so I think climate change is an appropriate one to put on the table. Arun talked about equity as well, and the interaction between climate change and equity is going to be enormous, right? It's already clear about who's affected, but at a broader scale, we are at a new kind of form. We need, of course, Gramsci's optimism of the will to motivate collective action at scales we don't yet know will materialize, nor the forms they'll take. And so what I want to say is that we've learned a lot in the past from various scholars of how social organization operates, whether it is Gramsci, Mary Douglas, Lynn Ostrom, who have given us some of the factors. Commons are effectively a space of alterity. They're a space in which we can be realizing values of collective action. And they are alternatives, as Arun put it, to markets and states. Now, I'm very pro-government or state, in the sense that I believe in democracy as a form of collective action, right? It's formalized in its own ways. It's not the informal commons, but it is a collective action. And these are spaces in which norms come to be materialized in action. So as climate change is closing down, I think, our commons in many ways, and our world, commons of resistance are going to be important. Commons of collective action that reopens the space. And these are spaces of collective social organization and hope, which is coming back to Arun's evoking of Gramsci. I think we're in a moment that is extraordinary. And it's an existential moment. I do think climate change does something that none of us have had to imagine. And that is, we as individuals imagine that we will die. And there's such thing as posterity. And posterity, in a certain sense, makes dying into something we can contemplate and imagine a future that continues without us. Gunther Anders, the husband of the first husband of Hannah Arendt, wrote about this with respect to the atomic bomb, which is that with climate change, we're at a whole new scale. We have to imagine the annihilation, not only of us and the people we love, who will all vanish anyway. That will happen, but we can almost accept that partly because we imagine a future. That imagining of a future is a collective project. And the minute we see the end of human time, I think what we are seeing is a kind of erasure, as Gunther Anders said, of posterity itself. The meaning of what we do now depends on having that future out there. It is not that we are responsible for future generations, but we depend on them for our very sense of identity and meaning in life. And so with that, I think this project of collective action has got to go away from logics of markets and away from logics of kind of formalized responsibility to logics of, instead of responsibility, our abilities to respond and how those are enabled by this thing we call the commons, collective action. Anyway, that's just my riffing off of Arun's work, which I think is an impressive project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesse and Arun. This is fantastic and so much food for thought. And just, this is such a timely conversation and topic, as both of you have mentioned. We're at a point where we can hear from the audience. Please enter your questions in the chat. I believe it's possible for you to raise your hand and we can call on you. But this is really meant to be, shall I say, a common space where we can think together about some of these big, even existential issues that both of our panelists and speakers have raised. So let us take advantage of that opportunity.
I could only say that, Esther, I agree with you. And thank you for your comment.
Yeah, so the comment is that, you know, we need science, natural and social, both that's guided by different norms and values. Deliberating what these norms should be and how to institutionalize them is where the frontiers in sustainability and commons research are. I don't know, Arun, would you like to speak to Esther's comment? And Jesse, if you had more to say as well, please feel free to chime in.
Arun, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I just unmuted myself. I think what Esther is saying is very appealing, and you know, at one level, both what Jesse said and what I said, and perhaps what Esther is saying, are the kinds of things we would like to see happen. But the question of whether and how and the pathways through which they could happen is still very opaque to at least to me. How do we reinvigorate the hope that the commons present a viable alternative to, yeah, really to the trajectories on which our world today is traveling, and traveling pretty fast. I think we all kind of know that when it comes to competition, when it comes to the collaboration, when it comes to collaboration between natural and social sciences, everybody is agreed that we need more of that. But that agreement falls to pieces when it comes time to actually support natural versus social sciences with resources and with funding. I think we want to create stronger connections between work on social movements and work on commons, but what is the concrete structure of strengthening that connection, strengthening those relationships? And so, I again feel like this is what we want. We see the challenges, we see the problems, we see a path forward, but how to get on it remains kind of not completely clear. And perhaps the answer is just get on it. Don't think about it,
Exactly.
just do it. And yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm good.
No, because I just want to respond to that a little, which is, I think commons are closing down, but I think that everything will reconfigure and new commons will open up. Commons are the interstices. They exist everywhere. They exist even in the most oppressive situations. And Alexander Waheli, in his book, what the hell is it called? Habeas Viscus, for example, writes about the carving out of life and actual space within concentration camps, within slavery, and how the ideas of homo faber are false, that there is no real complete suppression. There's a reemergence always from the very margins. The question is how not to fall into those situations of such extreme enclosure, as it were.
Thank you. Yeah, this is great. So there's a couple points in the chat. Let's try, Carlos has his hand up. So let me see if he can ask his question, and then we'll come back to those couple questions in the chat here. So Carlos, you should be able to ask your question now.
Oh, thank you, Dan. I just typed it in, but let me see if I can just try to phrase it. First of all, thank you again to the Flare organizers and Arun and Jess for those wonderful remarks. And Arun said that he was a little bit almost uncomfortable when he started talking about giving the title of the presentation, because the commons generate so much excitement within ourselves, and when we think about it, when we talk about it, and when we try to answer questions from the policy science interface, and we will do this, in my view, anyways, from the view of a very comfortable position of what I'm trying to describe as the non-commons. We have the government, as Jesse was trying to say, and we put the rules from a given governmental structure, and those rules operate for better or worse, et cetera, et cetera. But when we deal with the commons from this world, it's almost impossible to handle that idea of commons. It's very hard to manage it, to set the rules for that is the commons. And then there are very clear examples, the oceans, the atmosphere, and even worse when we talk about indigenous peoples and local communities. So my question is a little bit unfair, but it's a real legitimate question, is how do we bridge that gap between dealing with the commons from a perspective that doesn't really handle or even think about the commons? He talks about private property. We talk about rules that are very explicit, and those don't apply to dealing with the commons. So that, again, I'm sorry for the very general question, but there is a deep philosophical and legitimate interest in hearing what you think about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Arun?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know. Because if I knew the answer to your question, Carlos, if I really knew it, that's what I would be doing. But I guess my my partial, or how should I put it? Not partial, but response founded on things that are clouded in my own mind is that you in some ways you also gave the answer to the question you asked, which is we need to focus on the things that we do, but keep in mind the larger possibilities inherent in the small things we do. And that we need to work on making connections based on those possibilities of larger effects of what we are doing locally. And when I say doing locally, I mean not necessarily doing things in the world, but also just in terms of our research and in terms of our thinking. Because only in conversations and in connections does thinking become thought. In a sense, we come to some conclusions about what really we believe. Because until we are engaged in these interactions, what we are doing is only just doing it. Like the effects of what we are doing become visible when we connect with others, when we connect with what others are doing. So that's a very sort of partial, maybe dissatisfying answer, but at one level, I feel just doing things locally is insufficient. But on the other hand, if we can build connections, if we can create relationships and partnerships and interactions, that has a much greater possibility of reimagining what we think we are doing and reconfiguring where we think we are going.
Could I just follow up, and this will relate to a point that Esther has made in the chat about just the role of research in accompanying, in informing, and I'm not sure what the right verb is, but the role of research in this kind of bridging. Your thoughts on that?
Research is a way of abstracting and generalizing from the specific. And it is our job as researchers, first, to do research which always is predicated on normative motives, and to do it rigorously and objectively, and then to come back out and enter into a dialogue, into what is a discursive and iterative process of generalizing the knowledge rather than just abstracting and generalizing the concepts. That is, it's a dialectical relation with a public, and we have to find our publics and engage with them. And that's constant.
Arun, anything to add?
I was going to say that, we have this tendency to, and it's partly it is the result of the structures in which we live. We have this tendency to separate out the research that we do from the decision-making that happens, from the changes on the ground that occur with or without the benefit of research and decision-making. And, at one level, yes, that is true. These are very different from each other. But at another level, the kinds of research we do are very closely informed by and related to the things that we think are not right in this world. And, as trained as a political scientist, and I think much of the impetus for doing research in political science comes from the research that other political scientists are doing. And I've traded one kind of science, political science, for another kind of science, sustainability science. But I do think that there's a difference between what sustainability science stands for and what political science stands for, in terms of both the ambition to bridge divisions or gaps or lines between different disciplines, as also in terms of the, I think, really felt hope to bridge gaps between practice and action and thinking and research. So I think the not all of us do or can move beyond or move to thinking what we can also connect our research and our findings with. But some of us do, and I think that really is possible to do when it comes to thinking about sustainability and thinking about social ecological systems and thinking about commons research. And that I think is both something from which we need to draw more inspiration, but then to convert that inspiration also into conversations, but connections and change. So I don't want to accept that research on questions related to sustainability or resources or development occupies a completely different space from action and change on those very same questions. But the degree to which that connection becomes real depends on what we do beyond the research that we do. Yeah,
I agree.
And it's interesting, you're making these remarks in the context of the FLAIR meeting. And as I understand it, that's precisely the purpose of FLAIR, is to do some of the work that you've just described. That's a side comment, but I feel like FLAIR is one of the vehicles to help us have this conversation and enable that kind of relationship with what's happening in the world. I think there's a couple of questions now here, and I want to, a colleague, so let's see, so Jose Pablo has asked a question about commons research transitioning to a post-normal phase. So it's interesting, Arun, to hear your thoughts about commons research broadly construed as kind of normal science in the Kuhnian sense. And it would be interesting. It sounds like you're making an argument that it needs to transition to something post-normal, or we're at an inflection point. And certainly Jesse's remarks, about thinking about the existential situation that we find ourselves in, and is research actually heading in that direction? You're making the case it needs to, and I guess he follows up by saying, if posterity gives meaning to our existence, shouldn't we be more in touch with Ernst Bloch's principle of hope, theoretically wise? I will myself not claim to know what that principle is. If either of you do, wonderful. But I think the broader question of kind of where commons research is and might be going still stands.
One sec, there are people's questions in the Q&A as well as in the chat. So just so you're aware, there are more.
And I'll come back. There's a couple of them there that we'll get to. Thank you.
Maybe we can ask Carlos to talk a little bit. I do not know the cert. Like you, I'm not very well read. But no, I'm not very well read, and like you, I don't know the principle of hope and love from Bloch. So I would love to hear a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I don't know, Jose Pablo, if you would like to respond. I can unmute you. Yeah.
I do want to say a little bit in response to Forrest's question in the Q&A.
Yeah, we'll definitely get there.
Okay.
So Jose Pablo.
Sure, thank you. It's you know, Ernest Bloch is one of those scholars from the critical theory school, and he wrote this huge book about the principle of hope, which is basically to say that what we've got now is not necessarily what we are going to have in the future. I mean, it's a way of realization that what we are living today, it's more like the not yet version of what reality should be, or what reality should look like. So I was wondering to what extent we could actually, build a bridge, between Flair's narrative and these sort of critical approaches that actually invite us not to settle, with what's actually going on at the moment. And I think it is at this point in history, it's very important to substantiate, our claims both empirically and philosophically. And I would be, for starters, eager to join a working group on this issue, because I think it's really important to have these sort of robust theoretical substantiation to our claims, particularly these days, when they are talking the COP26, and quite honestly, they are letting us down, I think. Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying. Arun and Jesse, some response?
I think I agree with what you just said. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think the only maybe point to add is that, for all of what has happened in the work on commons, it's still a very, 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 very young field. I mean, research on the commons has been going on for a very long time, but the field has come into an acceptance of its own reality, I think, not much more than maybe 3 decades, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 4 decades. So it's, there's a lot that we still need to work on and do and accomplish, and to make the field more attractive to new participants. But to do so, we also need to, in part, as I said, realize work on the vision that is at the heart of research on commons, not in terms of a focus on rules and institutions, although that is very important and we are doing it, but also in terms of what kind of a future, what kind of a world do we want to live in, and what does a focus on community and intimacy and solidarity and connections say in contrast to a focus on, incentives and responses and mechanisms. Not that those are irrelevant, but they shouldn't exhaust the frame that makes up research on the commons and action for the commons. And I think doing that is also just really crucial to both to distinguish what work on commons is about, and to make it more relevant to addressing the kinds of challenges that we can see in front of our eyes. We don't have to look too far ahead. They're right here in front of us.
Jesse, anything to add?
I don't have much to add other than to say this is about the production of hope. Now, I don't know if it's in Ernest Bloch's sense, but we envision futures, we desire them, we imagine them, and we generate them through that process. And we do it collectively and individually, because we are constituted by the collective, but we also constitute the collective. And I do think that it's a complex process, because the future never becomes what we actually imagined. And so there's always also a disappointment and a readjustment. And it's a process, not an end point. So, I mean, for me, it's kind of like we're making worlds. And that is equally something that happens in the research we do as in our dialogues with the broader public.
Thank you. We've got a few questions here open in the chat. So one comes from Forrest Fleischman, and I'll just read it. That Arun mentioned that a key role of commons research to demonstrate that local communities can do sustainable management has been realized. But this still isn't recognized by policymakers and indeed by many collaborators in other fields. So for example, ecologists that might promote exclusive protected areas as the only possible solution for biodiversity loss. How can we engage in addressing this?
Yeah, I just want to say that there are things in the world that research cannot accomplish. The reason people may not be willing to realize what the field of research and commons has accomplished has nothing to do with the work or the evidence or the knowledge that the field has generated. It has everything to do with, it has everything to do with what makes different fields of knowledge production justify their own existence at some level, I guess. You're not going to recognize knowledge that threatens the reasons for the kinds of knowledge that you yourself are producing. So, where at one level one can say that research on the commons has had, together with other fields, has had a substantial effect on how we think about effective ways to live with and manage and govern and use and sustain different kinds of social ecological systems. But at the same time, there are many who do not think that this works or this makes sense. And so I just want to say that, for many of those who do not think that or who are not convinced by it, doing more research is not going to change how they think, and because what they think is linked to, the common insight, where you stand depends on where you sit, or where you sit depends on where you stand, something like that. So I don't know that you can change everybody's minds by doing more research. And sometimes it's easier to just leave those who are not in agreement. You don't always have to have everybody think the same way about something. I think sometimes it's easier and more convenient to sidestep an obstacle than to try to overcome it. So that's one thought I have. Saying that is not to say that we shouldn't continue to try to find more advocates, but I think when it comes to changing what happens in the world, working only on research is not going to accomplish it. We also have to, and that's where I think the importance of connections and partnerships and building community and reaching out and interacting with others is just as important for realizing a vision of a different alternative world as doing research is, and perhaps even more important than that.
It goes beyond that. I think you're absolutely right. And I would say confrontation is part of what we need to be part of. I don't mean violence. I mean, face-to-face confronting people, but how do we confront them? I'm in a project right now where I have worked with climate modelers at Columbia University, at the Earth Institute, who are all involved in impact assessments of climate change. And I have managed to, over years of working with them, get them to understand that there are normative implications to the models of causality that they choose. And by using moral argumentation, a la Hannah Arendt's kind of insistence that it is thought in which we ask ourselves whether we can live with the implications of our action, and we confront others with the way in which a fortress conservation is destructive to human life and well-being, right? We confront climate modelers with the fact that their model occludes certain kinds of causal relations that might lead us to different types of solutions. Those are the necessary dialogues. And having done the research on the commons, we are in the position to walk into those rooms with a certain empirical and, I think, convincing position that says there are moral issues at stake that you need to consider that are implicitly ignored or even confronted in your models. And that's part of the scientific dialogue, as all models are normatively founded in some way or another, or chosen.
Yeah, right. Makes sense.
You have something else to add?
No, just saying, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, this I think transitions to one of the questions that's in the last one here about environmental education, and we can interpret that maybe a bit broadly, place-specific engagement with specific places and people, and maybe there's a field of environmental education as well that could be relevant. But this person is asking ways to use environmental education to think about the commons, and especially for nudging policymakers who seem environmentally illiterate. And I will say that there's something to be said about being in a specific place to facilitate dialogue across difference. And I think of the work of Rebecca Hardin and Melissa Remus, biological anthropology and cultural anthropology, being able to have a dialogue at two US universities, but they have a very different conversation when they're doing work in Central African rainforests and they're in the place. There's something about being in specific places that allows, I think, for this kind of dialogue. Arun, Jesse, further reflections on that question?
Jesse, what would you say? I mean, I think I don't know how much no, let me put it slightly differently. I think incorporating work on the commons in environmental education is central to more effective education for, well, let me put it even slightly more differently. I think we live in a world where our imagination of what is possible is structured by narratives of incentives and responses, disincentives and fear. And when I think about what we learn in terms of environmental education, I'm struck by the extent to which our understanding of what is possible to do is dominated by underlying models that we have in our heads about what human beings are about, what human nature is. Yeah. And in this model of human nature, what you do is structured by what you get. If you get more of something positive, you do more of what getting that positive thing requires. And I just am not convinced that that is who human beings are. And in this context, I'd say some of the most interesting work is that which goes to the very heart of why is it that we behave and think and respond the way that we do? And is that true across cultures? Is that way of responding, is that way of behaving true across cultures? And I think we have some significant amount of evidence that people don't just respond to incentives in the same way across all issues, across all places, across all contexts. And we need to place a much higher emphasis, much greater emphasis on thinking through why is it and when is it that we work to achieve goals of solidarity, goals of sociality, goals of collectivity together. And if the only way to make that happen is by putting incentives and putting threats in place. And so, to my mind, environmental education is, yes, crucial and central to what we can think is possible, but it is also crucial and central to rethink what environmental education itself is, and whether we need to rethink our understandings of who we are as human beings, and when we act as humans and when we act as machines. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think we buy into, because we all live in societies and in contexts where some version of a liberal capitalist democracy is the context. We come to take its features as normal and its influence on humans as the thing that humans are.
As natural.
I think to imagine a different world, we have to first say, is what we imagine about human nature the only way human nature exists?
And the forces keeping us thinking in particular ways seem to be growing ever stronger. You know, thinking of likes on social media, or just the way in which we're conditioned increasingly in an electronic world, which is a certain kind of environment, but perhaps not the one that this meeting attendee is talking about. Jesse, would you like to add anything else? Any other comments on this?
I don't think politicians are environmentally illiterate. I think they're environmentally deaf. I think it's a little different. And I mean that in the sense that they simply, it's not even deaf, they don't listen. And they don't listen exactly because they believe in these narrow, incentively structured sensibilities about how to reproduce their place in life. As E. Cummings said, in an era when you could talk about men to represent everyone, he said, a politician is an ass upon which everyone has sat, except a man. And I think we have to rethink how politics operates in some ways. I don't know how, but you're bringing up politicians and policymakers. I feel that sometimes good people get in there, and I don't think their incentive is to maximize their own good. I think their incentive is a moral one often, and those are great people to have in there. And unfortunately, I don't know where to go with that. I don't have enough understanding of the bizarre nature of the way global politics are going, including its turn towards fascism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Pretty anti-common, although, you know, interesting to think about who the common, you know, the walling off of a certain kind of commons that's something that occurs to me is the fragmentation of the commons and the restriction is that there's sort of private commons, it's an oxymoron, or club commons in a way. And we're, as society is increasingly fragmented, and there seem to be these sort of, as if they're isolated pastures in the mountains of types of commons that makes the kind of dialogue and research and accompaniment that you're talking about challenging.
That comes right back to Arun's comments about human nature. I think human nature is itself socially produced. And I think what is happening in these fragmented worlds is we are creating different kinds of communities of sensibility. And I think that's something that needs attention, but I wouldn't know where to go with that either.
Yeah. There's one more question here. And I would just highlight that one of the sessions we had earlier this morning was a breakout group on forests and social justice, material and moral dimensions that Anne Larson moderated. I think Anne is on the call or in this webinar. And so, Anne, if you have any suggestions that are emerging from that session or your own thinking, I would encourage you to join in it if you'd like. Just raise your hand and I can call you.
Anne.
I was just running to another meeting, so I actually missed what you said. I was just checking.
Happy birthday to you.
2 o'clock meeting. But I'll take 5 minutes. So what was the question? I'm sorry.
Another question was if you had, it was just riffing off of the ongoing discussion that we've been having that apparently you might have missed, but just on the sort of moral dimensions of forests and commons more generally, if things that are germane to this discussion now emerged from your session this morning, but it might be hard for you to intervene at this point unless you have something, but feel free.
No, I mean, it was, I mean, the session on social justice was a bit covering so many different topics in, 8 presentations on 8 different things about what we mean by this, what it looks like, how do you actually do it? And I think that the big question is, parallel to this, to what the discussion has been here, is how do you actually do it? And I think, something you said, Arun, a bit earlier is this separation between research and our lives is not a real one. And I think, my principle at this point, and, I'm getting older, so maybe that's part of it, is that I should be living the principles that I research in my life in every daily interaction that I have. So, to the extent that we build these moral relations around us, have interactions with everyone we meet in ways that we want the world to be. I mean, that's kind of how I see it at this point in my life. So I don't know if it's a moral dilemma about forests and commons, but that's where I see social justice, spreading from our research into our real everyday lives.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, for me, that connects to the point that you were making, Jesse, about confrontation, and the need for that, as uncomfortable as it can be, but as important as it is. And confrontation certainly need not be violent,
No.
but it can be a genuine discussion. It requires, it can spur that, but you must raise the issue and raise the question first in order to then have it lead to dialogue and discussion, which, to be frank, in our increasingly, electronic world, it's hard to do. It's hard. I've found this discussion so far to be very, and even surprisingly intimate, given the format, and I'm very grateful for that. But it's not easy to achieve through computers, ones and zeros. And so this kind of face-to-face, so to Anne's point about being in the world, it seems that there's something really important there that resonates with what the two of you have been saying. It also makes me think of Catherine Hayhoe, a well-known climate scientist, her recent book and work on, just talking to people about climate change in this case. But reflections from the two of you, Arun and then Jesse.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything different to say. I feel like, yeah, it is absolutely necessary for us to connect with others and to interact with others. And we think of research as a kind of solitary enterprise, and perhaps it's also important to realize that it's not necessarily so. There are so many different ways in which you can, even when doing research, you can work with many others. And it's not just the effect research has on practice, it's also effect research has on thinking and the advantages it gains as a means to make a difference by being in the world rather than by being in the discipline or the interdiscipline for that matter. So I think that connection and that feedback between what you do and why you do it and what's the effect of what you do are things we need always to keep in mind, right? I mean, I feel the vision or the image of a scientist or a researcher sitting in their office or their lab working with materials to produce and some deep insight is just not what happens in the work on commons. That it's much more about being inspired by what's happening in the world and by hoping and doing what it takes to translate that hope into action and interactions. So hoping and doing what your thinking and research lead you towards. So I don't know that is very different from what I said earlier, but yeah, and then I acknowledge that it's not easy to do all that, especially in our hyper specialized world of what we are expected to do in our lives and how we are incentivized, to use an ugly word, to do what we do.
Thank you.
But I also detect at least some signs of change, maybe not in specific disciplines, but certainly in schools of environment and sustainability. There's some emphasis on and attention to not just the work you're doing, but also what you're doing about that work after you've done the research.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Jesse, did you want to chime in? We've got a couple of questions here in the chat as well.
Well,
Feel free.
I just wanted to say that I think in the natural sciences, this is true as well. If you read the works of Paul Feyerabend, the social embeddedness is deep and important. And this meeting, I think, is important that we're having right now, because the ideas we're expressing here, what I'm finding is a resonance. I think there is something transformative going on at a larger scale that has to do with exactly what Anne said in the end about the link between our work as researchers and practice. How do we do that? And I think there are a lot of fronts, and we do it opportunistically, but it is happening. And something, I think there's a sense of necessity growing around this, and we may want to knock heads together. I find it very affirming of my own thinking to hear what you all have had to say.
Yeah, I like that as a practical point, that to continue thinking about this topic, which is certainly at the heart of what FLAIR is about. So certainly this is a general invitation to continue the discussion about these very issues. I'd like to be sure that we answer the two questions that are here. So Margarita Nielsen asks, a basic question, a big question about how we organize our societies as opposed to market and state. And she asked about this kind of maximum size beyond which commons would not work. And I think both of you, Arun and Jesse, have talked about this in perhaps even slightly different ways, with Jesse placing a little bit more of the accent on even the state. And I myself sometimes wonder, this, in a democracy anyway, the state is a commons, right? It should be. And so this kind of blurring of the state and commons, and it gets me to a related and general question about kind of the conceptual stretching that seems to be happening in our discussion, which I'm not against, but of the concept of the commons and what that means. But Margarita's, her specific question is about the maximum size beyond which commons would not work. And she says, I'm thinking of the need for commons to be locally governed and managed. If I get you right, the idea of scale is not a larger commons, but a lot more of commons that connect, and how to make those connections more effective, self-regulating complex systems. And she wonders if she understood you correctly, Arun, or what this means for kind of social organization at this point. A lot to chew on, but over to you, Arun.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Margarita, you're raising a lot of really complex questions and not necessarily ones that I've thought about very deeply. So anything I say is really going to be much more speculative and based on very patchy understanding. Yes, so as a general statement, yes, I think it is likely the case that communities where we expect direct interactions between members to be driving much of what happens in the community, those communities are going to be harder to structure and for them to govern themselves if they are much larger than 150, 200, 250 people. I think there's also a fair amount of research that suggests that the capacity of human beings to interact is roughly around 150 to 200. Doesn't matter whether they're interacting in face-to-face communities or in communities that are constructed through and around electronic media or in Siberia. So in that sense, yes, that is true. And I think that is true as much of commons as it is of really any other mechanism to structure interactions among human beings. But whether it is large cities or it is small communities, the effective neighborhood sizes or effective sizes of people's sort of social communities, not spatial communities, is still the same. So in that sense, nested communities about which Nostrom also talked, or communities that have some bases for representation and articulation of interests of member subcommunities, is an obvious answer to your question, or to your thinking, or to your not answer, but obvious response to your thinking about how do larger commons or larger groups organized as commons come into being. At one level, the question of hierarchy and structure is really about the kinds of expectations and rules that create the connections between different communities. So hierarchy is not a necessary condition of increasing size. It's a condition much more of distribution of power and distribution of resources than of groups becoming larger. And I think, human societies all over the world have experimented with different forms of organization and different levels of hierarchy. And I don't know that experimentation is at an end, or that it naturally reaches its culmination in a hierarchical structure. So yeah, I don't know, they're kind of isolated thoughts. So much more to think about on this.
Jesse, you typed something in the chat. Feel free to share that or anything else.
No, it's been shared with everyone. It was just that Al Gore was basically saying we have a global commons, we're all in it together. The tongue in cheek in a certain way because it's not that meaningful, but I do think we imagine commons, and it's at the point at which we can imagine being part of a collective that scale is constructed.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, what Jesse just said, that no community exists without the imagination of its members that they're part of the same community. And that community can be as large as a nation state. There's no sort of limit to what an imagination might make you belong to.
The old book, Imagined Communities.
Right.
I think that the connection of hope and imagination, I hadn't thought of them in those terms, but just hope requires imagination, it seems.
So does fear. As Mary Douglas
So
put
does
it,
fear.
danger is in her mind what creates the need to organize and to draw boundaries and to determine who is us, who is them. It's a kind of reductionist view, but both require an imagination.
I think that's possibly a good segue. So we've got, there are a couple of comments. So Lakshmi Krishnan had made a comment earlier, not so much a question, but just a comment. And I wanted to acknowledge that. But Laura Sells has a question open here where she writes, we've gone to a somewhat individual and psychological level, which is really important and something interesting that's come up in FLAIR meetings in the past. But I wonder if we might be more explicit about thinking through the role of power. And part of that question of why policy and practice don't follow what we know from commons research has to do with asymmetric power relations and entrenched interests, no doubt. To cede power in the context of perhaps money, is antithetical to the current dominant power structures. So what are the options for pushing for more just dispersed relations of power? Is her question.
Tiny question.
Laura, you are going to answer that question, right?
Well,
Okay, Laura's saying no. Jesse, why don't you start?
Avanti popolo, alla riscosso, rivoluzione. Anyway, I don't know where to start.
I mean, this is the question. This was the real question. So
It is a real question.
How do we confront entrenched power, entrenched structures? And
Piecemeal.
I don't know that there's a clear, nicely cut and dried answer to that question.
Well, there are lots of answers in history, right?
Well, and in the present, right? I mean, sorry, go ahead, Jesse, and then I'll say.
No, I mean, I don't buy any of them, but Althusser has crisis theory, says that if we all are prepared when the moment of crisis comes, we can steer the direction that reshaping of authority takes, right? Marx had his asymptotic ideas that never came to be, but the whole revolution versus reform, I tend to be on a piecemeal basis because I don't like conflict, even though I like confrontation, which I don't see as a violent act. I see it as an engagement. It's tough, I don't know, and there will be violence, but hopefully as little as possible.
But Dan, I see that you would like to answer this question live in the question and answers.
You being you. I'm just the moderator here. I mean, no, it's just such an important question and one of our times. And perhaps some of the answer to it is unfurling as we speak in Glasgow, you know, with what students are doing and others.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's part of the answer to it. I think what we're doing now is part of the answer to it, this dialogue and discussion and, you know, frank discussion about big, important things in an intimate way. And I think research, I don't want to give up on research and I don't think we have here, being so important to shed light, the media, just critical to shed light on the corners where entrenched interests are able to operate without, you know, in the dark, to the detriment of people and planet. So I think just a role for research in my own work, a big motivation for doing work on funding is money matters in a lot of ways. And if we can follow it, it gives us insights into what's going on. So I would say research and building knowledge about what's actually happening, and then having forums and opportunities to talk about what potential responses could be based on that information is at least part of the story. That's just me riffing. Laura, I don't know if we'll let you out of this. I know you're here for the expert insights, but I'm sure you have your own thoughts on this.
Nope is not an answer, Laura.
Feel free to answer your own question if you feel like our panelists have missed something.
Jump in.
Oh dear, I've been unmuted. Thank you for your insights. It is a hard question, and it's something I've just been grappling and sitting with a lot recently. And it came up in a set of interviews I was doing with foundation representatives about their approaches to funding conservation in communities. And somebody actually brought it up as a foundation rep, talking about that it's their own little revolutionary act in some ways, is how do they give away as much money as they can to the social justice oriented conservation causes that they can. And I've been sitting with it for a while. And it also touches on, for me, some of my other research and just trying to think about from the perspective of some of our Indigenous colleagues who are trying to point out that none of the money, for the most part, committed under the COPs of the past for forest mitigation has really reached them. And they're continuing to face these massive existential threats, while that, you know, and fossil fuel subsidies continuing to go towards the very cause of our problem, and none of this money that is meant to be the solution, none of these big pledges are leading to actual disbursements of funding to places that ostensibly need it. So if money is power in a capitalist system, you know, if capital is the power, and it continues to stay concentrated and be funneled to the sources of the destruction that we're facing, we're facing a pretty bleak future. But I do think there are opportunities, and I agree with Dan, the work around financing and funding is essential in terms of just identifying where it is, where it's going, what it's doing, and what it is not. So from the research perspective, but then in terms of the moving that forward, I still get stuck too. And I think this is one little, you know, snippet of the larger lens that I'm coming from in terms of working with Indigenous peoples in Central America. But I think it touches on so many of the other elements around livelihoods and production, you know, forms of production and labor and migration. So yeah, I don't have an answer either, which is why, you know, I'm just sitting with it, and thank you for sitting on it with me.
Yeah.
Laura,
so sorry, go ahead, Jesse.
Just going to say, you remind me in what you're saying of Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation, and the whole idea, the enlightened self-interest of capital. There may be some of that in this mix too at some point, one can hope.
Yeah.
Sorry, Arun, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to add two more thoughts to what Laura said. One is that there is tremendous heterogeneity even in the structures of power that we are all part of, which is to say that what will influence or what will lead to a shift in what different people do is not the same thing. It's a different thing that, in some cases it may be information, in some cases it may be mobilization, in some cases it may be money, in some cases it may be more direct action. And we don't a priori know what it is, but part of the strategic work of trying to work on change is also trying to figure out what kind of lever, what kind of push works for which groups of people, and for some, nothing might work. And the second thing I thought was that these structures are not built in a day, and I don't think we can dismantle them quickly either, that we can change them quickly either. And we always run the risk that in the process of dismantling what exists, we just create new structures of power and coercion and and control. So I think, and this kind of takes me back again to the idea that, we have to try and we have to work, and we don't know if that will lead to what we want, but we certainly won't get what we want without trying. So
I think that's probably a good way for us to wrap up. That we won't get what we want without trying. And I guess, this for me has been a extraordinarily rich conversation that's touched on a lot of different topics. And I think, just in the context of flair and forests and livelihoods, obviously we've been much more far-ranging than that. And I would encourage those of you that have been taking part in the flair meetings to think about how some of what we've discussed here is relevant to your own work and your own practice as individuals, as well as professionals. And there's a lot for us to think about. I know that I am excited to do some of that thinking, and flair is meant as a vehicle to help facilitate that. There were a few ideas that emerged here about follow-ups, and would love to be in touch with anybody that's joined the webinar to think through how we might make some progress on this very broad topic. And I really want to thank Arun for encouraging us, as ever, to think big, to think different, to raise important questions. And a takeaway for me is about the commons and thinking about it, not just in terms of natural resources, as so often our field has, but social relationships and a whole bunch of other ways. So thank you so much for that, I would say, invitation. And thank you so much, Jesse, for your thoughts and comments. And I wish we could retire to somewhere and have some nice drinks and maybe something warm to eat. But alas, here we are on the internet. But maybe you'll be able to do that yourselves with people that you care about in your places. It's great to see so many people that have joined, and please join me in thanking our two presenters.
Good to see you.
So much, everybody. And we will, for those in the flair meeting, we will reconvene tomorrow morning. Students, there's a special student mixer. Please do join that. And then we have a great session, another webinar showing a film with voices from communities in forests in Madagascar. I think it'll be a great session. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Toodaloo.
Toodaloo.
Toodaloo.